The Equality Act would ensure that LGBTQ Americans are protected from discrimination in public accommodations, education, federally funded program, employment, housing, credit, and jury service. Many of the attacks on this bill are nothing more than the latest in a long line of fear-mongering targeting the LGBTQ community. When their attacks on marriage equality failed, opponents turned to attacking equality for the transgender community, claiming that equality for trans Americans placed girls and women at risk. We've so far seen more than 80 bills introduced during 2021 state legislative sessions attacking the transgender community.
I want to share the story of one of the many people that we should be keeping in mind as we consider this legislation, the mother of a young student athlete, Chelsea Mitchell. Chelsea is a star high school athlete in Connecticut. She told us she'd like to retain the right to compete on equal footing with other biological girls. Instead, this accomplished athlete has been forced to compete against biological men.
No one should have to live their life with the ugly curse of discrimination, slamming shut the doors of opportunity, preventing one's participation in so many aspects of our national life. That discrimination is the very opposite of freedom. It is the very opposite of dignity. It is the very opposite of equality.
We don't oppose equality, but we do oppose legislation when you take the rights of one and dismiss the rights of others. We should all be able to respect each other, disagree, and still honor each other in our disagreements. That's who we are as Americans.
Although this act purports the prevention of discrimination, it actually causes it by undermining hard-fought protections for women. By changing the meaning of the word sex under the federal law to encompass gender identity, and by applying that expanded definition across context and without exception, this law eliminates private spaces for biological women, including single-sex schools, dormitories, sororities, and sports teams. I'm reminded on a daily basis that my presence here wouldn't be possible without generations of brave women who came before me. They fought tirelessly for equality for American women, and I have benefited from that work. One area where women have long been underrepresented is on the playing field. Before the passage of Title IX in 1972, girls and women didn't have the same opportunity that boys and men did when it came to athletics. Title IX changed that. Statistics show that since the passage of this important law, female participation in sports has increased more than 900%. Unfortunately, the Equality Act would undermine that progress, opening positions on women's teams to biological men, not just transgender athletes who have blocked the onset of male puberty, but are living as women. But any male who simply says he identifies as female, whether transgender or not. This is the problem created by the Act when it substitutes the vague and open-ended term gender identity for the word sex. Gender identity can mean almost anything. Last year, Duke Law School professor Dorianne Coleman had the opportunity to testify before the House Judiciary Committee to express her concerns with how the Equality Act would affect women's athletics. She looked specifically at the athletic data of 3 female athletes who won gold medals for Team USA, comparing those achievements to the athletic performance of thousands of boys and men who were considered second-tier athletes. The results were astonishing. This is important. The data makes it clear that even superb Olympic medal-winning female athletes would lose to male-bodied athletes who were considered second-tier in the men's category.
Here in the United States, women have fought hard for equal treatment. The Equality Act, as drafted, undermines the fight by putting women in danger and taking away the right of women to feel safe in women-only spaces like domestic violence shelters and prisons. It should be obvious why we don't want men to have open access to women-only shelters, but let's get a few examples on the record. In Alaska, the city of Anchorage passed their own version of the Equality Act, and a women's shelter was investigated by the State Equal Rights Commission after the shelter turned away a transgender woman. In the end, they were vindicated by a court ruling recognizing their status as a faith-based nonprofit. But imagine how it must have felt for the vulnerable women in that shelter to watch as investigators weaponized these new standards against what should have been a safe haven. A shelter in California went in the opposite direction and chose to ignore abuse by a transgender man against a group of women rather than risk a complaint. I've been speaking with representatives from shelters in Tennessee, and they're extremely concerned about how the Equality Act would affect their ability not only to protect women, but to support them mentally and emotionally. Society doesn't look upon incarcerated women with the same sympathy as it does abused women. But I would assert that when it comes to safety, it shouldn't matter if those women are in shelters or in prisons. Women serving sentences for crimes they committed should not be put into situations where they cannot escape and made victims to other crimes. Women's safety is fundamental to the fight for women's rights. So why, I would ask my colleagues, would they push so hard for a regressive, repressive piece of legislation that walks back women's rights and endangers women's lives? Women should never have to fear for their safety because they're forced to share spaces with men.
The Equality Act threatens to halt federal assistance for students at single-sex colleges and universities. While Title IX provides exemptions for women's colleges like Smith, Morehouse, and Wellesley, Title VI does not. The Equality Act provides no exemptions. As the measure allows anyone, anywhere, for any reason to claim an identity, this also leaves women in single-sex dormitories vulnerable to college-age males identifying or posing as women. Women who want to be housed with other women may instead find they've been placed with a biological male as a roommate. A woman's choice won't matter.
The most important thing in life is to be authentic. I think we all understand that. I want to tell you the story of our family because it is the story of millions of American families across this nation. More than 5 years ago, before she had transitioned, my daughter, at just 14 years old, had experienced deep depression and anxiety. Unable to identify the cause of her pain, she told her parents that the only two solutions she felt would solve it was either suicide or running away. I'll say that again. She was in such a spot, she felt that suicide or running away were the only options. Heartbroken but determined not to lose our child, we enrolled in a local day therapy program. One night after her program, my daughter perked up in her chair at the dinner table, excited to share some news. She told us she had figured it out. "Mom, I'm not a boy. I'm a girl, and my name is Evie Newman." Everything had clicked at that moment. She had been pretending to be something she wasn't. She wasn't being authentic. And as we all know, it is the hardest thing in the world to pretend every day. It was the happiest day of our lives. Our family was whole again. Still, as a mother, I knew the challenges ahead. My daughter would not grow up in a nation where, as an example, in 25 states, she could be discriminated against merely because of who she was. That was upsetting to me. She could be thrown out of a restaurant. She could be evicted from her apartment. She could be denied access to education and denied health care just because of who she is. On that, On top of that, the likelihood of facing hateful, vile attacks, and she has, verbal and physical, for simply existing and being her authentic self was almost a certainty. No American should have to live a lie. Imagine if I asked any of you on this dais or on the committee today to simply try being someone you absolutely are not, to try being the opposite gender of the way you feel deeply. To try to be something that you are not every day is very difficult. Do this for a week, a month, a year, and I guarantee you will feel deep depression, great anxiety, and yes, even suicidal. If you pass this legislation, we can show millions of Americans that their government accepts them and will protect them for who they are. As I said in the beginning, being authentic to yourself and to everyone is the most important thing to do.
My name is Alfonso David, and I am the president of the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest civil rights organization working to achieve equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. Discrimination, unfortunately, is alive and well in this country, and we need to address it. Despite all of the work that we've done, there is an epidemic of violence against the transgender community, particularly Black transgender women, pushed to the margins by racism and transphobia and sexism and homophobia. Black trans women in this nation live daily with the threat of violence, a threat that is heightened by attacks at every level of government. Last year alone, we had 44 transgender women who were killed in this country, more than any other year in recorded history. The facts are very clear that as LGBTQ people living in this country, we live with fear. We live not knowing if we can walk home safely at night. And that's reflected in the fact that 44 transgender women, most of them Black and brown, were killed in this country last year. How can you justify denying services to someone based on their gender identity, their sexual orientation, or their status? We need to make sure that the services that are being provided in a non-discriminatory way. The Equality Act does not force anyone to do anything other than not to discriminate. The legislation doesn't create some new reality. It simply allows transgender students to not be discriminated against in sports. We've known for years that the religious belief does not excuse restaurants or hotels from following our civil rights laws that were passed in the 1960s. And they still can't deny civil rights for Black and brown people in this country, but they can for LGBTQ people. So we have to think about how religion has been used historically to oppress marginalized communities, as you said, from colonization to slavery to interracial relationships to now LGBTQ families. And we have to make sure that if we are going to advance our democracy in a way that works for all of us, we need to make sure that all of us are indeed protected.
I believe unjust discrimination is always wrong. All Americans should be treated fairly. We've heard about the threats posed by the Equality Act to females. I share those concerns because biological sex matters. In law, medicine, the Equality Act thus cements into law an ideological belief that identity is self-defined regardless of the sexed body. It suppresses opposing beliefs and punishes those who dissent. But sex does matter. Only females experience female puberty, pregnancy, birth, and menopause. That's biology, and no one can self-define into or out of biological reality. Biology also makes females uniquely vulnerable when safety and privacy are compromised. 9 out of 10 rape victims are female. When the law privileges gender identity over sex, females suffer the consequences. The Equality Act also reaches far beyond Bostock, which pertain to the workplace, by expanding public accommodations to mean wherever Americans gather, even virtually. Churches, synagogues, temples, faith-based schools, soup kitchens, women's shelters will be subject to government coercion. Compromise your religious beliefs or risk endless litigation. Recipients of federal funds are also targeted, even for the simple act of maintaining sex-segregated bathrooms. This means a Muslim food bank or a Christian center for female survivors of domestic violence will be punished for doing good while following their religious teachings. The same is true for private schools participating in federal school lunch programs. Urban Catholic schools provide life-changing education to low-income children. They face an untenable choice: violate their religious beliefs about sexual difference in marriage, or turn away students who rely on federal help. Faith-based adoption and foster care programs are also at risk. Any religious house of worship, faith-based charity that abides by restrictions based on biological sex. So, for example, if you have a Jewish charitable outreach that separates men and women, it's going to be subject to a discrimination lawsuit because they're going to be risking violation of that provision protecting gender identity. So it is not true to say that people of faith don't lose anything. We lose everything. This just prevents the Religious Freedom Restoration Act from being available to us. It's a complete, just radical change in the rights of religious Americans. What this does is it expands that definition of public accommodations from the 4 categories that were previously in civil rights law to an almost unlimited number of activities and places that don't even need to be actual physical places. So it includes virtual activities and things like that. So it's very easy for a church that does anything where it opens the doors to the community, which is very much a part of a faith-based mission. It opens the doors for them to be subject to discrimination suits because they're now going to be considered a public accommodation in the same way as a stadium or something like that.
Members of the committee, if your daughter or granddaughter was the top high school tennis player in her state, and then 5 biological boys suddenly decided at the age of 17 to identify as female, should she drop overnight to number 6? Should she lose her college scholarship to a male-bodied athlete who would never have qualified on the boys' team? Does that strike any member of this committee as fair or just? If a woman in your state commits a crime, should she be put in a correctional facility with biological males, some of whom are sex offenders, some of whom may have only begun identifying as female weeks earlier, all of whom could easily overpower her? If a preschool has a policy that only female teachers may accompany little girls to the bathroom, and your daughter's male teacher suddenly identifies as female, ought that teacher to have a legal entitlement to accompany her? Should a female abuse survivor at a domestic violence shelter be forced to sleep and undress next to a biological male? The plain truth is that it is not sensible, not safe, and certainly not just to end these hard-won protections for women and girls in the name of equality. For some girls, athletics is the only chance they'll have to shine for the entire course of their lives. This bill would make it impossible ever to legally distinguish between a woman and a biological male who claims a female identity for whatever amount of time and for whatever reason or purpose. And gender identity can be very ephemeral. Even prominent gender therapists attest that people can be on a gender journey and identify as one thing one day and another the next. Should we undermine women's sports and protective spaces to allow gender-fluid males a gender journey? Just last week, after the Washington Correctional Center for Women began housing prisoners according to gender identity, 6 men transferred into the women's prison. One of the inmates raped a female in the women's prison upon arrival. If you pass this bill, you can expect hundreds more victims like this one. And that has nothing to do with transgender people and everything to do with opportunistic self-identification by violent male felons. Gender ideology tells women and girls that they are not entitled to their fear or their sense of unfairness as their protective spaces are eliminated. They must never object that sports is, and has always been, a matter of biology, not identity. They mustn't assert that we keep women's protective spaces for biological women to ensure their physical safety regardless of how they identify, because it isn't our identities that are at risk, it's our bodily integrity. Being a woman is a lifetime commitment. It entails profound blessings, but also physical vulnerabilities. For generations, women like the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg fought to create sex-based protections to make life safe and fair for women. If you vote to take away those rights, don't pretend you've achieved a civil rights victory. In the name of inclusivity, you'll have made life far less safe, far less fair, and far less inclusive for America's women and girls. The organizational effects of testosterone, even if the bioactive level of testosterone is later brought down, the permanent organizational effects of testosterone give men larger hearts, larger lungs, vastly greater muscle mass, bone density, fast-twitch muscle fiber, all things necessary in contests of strength and speed. And in her own state, where 2 biological boys with no standout achievements on the boys' team were able to compete with the top female athletes. In 2019, they walked away with 13 out of 14 championship title events. The law is so overbroad that any male felon can announce he's a female, make absolutely no changes, and transfer to a woman's prison. I do think it's worth noting that they are the only ones asked to sacrifice here for the sake of the Equality Act. The sacrifice is entirely on the shoulders of women and girls. Men have no comparable sacrifice when a biological female enters their spaces, or when a biological female, however she identifies, competes with them in sports. It doesn't threaten their spaces, it doesn't threaten their safety, and it doesn't threaten their opportunities. The great American Allison Felix, great American sprinter, ran the 400-meter in 49.26 seconds. And in 2018, nearly 300 high school boys could beat her. No boys will suffer because biological girls enter their sports, but girls will lose material opportunities.
Hi, I'm Stella, and I'm transgender. Less than half of the states in our country provide equal protection for me under the law. What happens if I want to attend a college in a state that doesn't protect me? Right now, I could be denied medical care or be evicted for simply being transgender in many states. How's that even right? How's that even American? What if I'm offered a dream job in a state where I can be discriminated against? Even if my employer is supportive, I still have to live somewhere. I have to eat in restaurants, and I have to have a doctor. And why am I having to worry about all this at the age of 16? I can tell you that majority of the transgender people who join sports just want to hang out with their friends. And that's basically it.
40% of the top 50 charities in the United States are faith-based, and religious institutions provide more than $1 trillion in societal benefit every year. If this bill passes, a bureaucrat in Washington, however, may show up at their doorstep one day. Or an official-looking letter may arrive in the mail, and the bureaucrat will ask whether the charity operates according to beliefs about gender identity that were totally and completely novel until just yesterday. And when they become mandatory, even though they remain deeply unpopular with the American people. And if these citizens refuse, whether out of faith or common sense or both, they will be punished. Their religious schools will be cut off from federal aid. Their battered women's shelters will be sued for supposed discrimination for refusing to admit men. Millions of Americans will be treated as second-class citizens and threatened with lawsuits simply for believing that men are men and women are women. That is the heart of this so-called Equality Act. Most Americans believe this is wrong-headed, even if they are too scared to say it for fear of being kicked off social media, or losing their job, or losing their spot in school. But I am not scared to say it, and I will say it for them.
I believe in freedom of religion. I believe in free exercise. I believe in the fundamentals that our country was founded upon. Amen. But I also know that for too long, religion is used to discriminate has been a painful part of the story of America. You know, we have seen this phenomenon of religion being used to justify slavery, segregation, bans on interracial marriage. In fact, as recently as 1983, Bob Jones University argued before the Supreme Court that its racially discriminatory marriage and dating policies were protected by the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. We know this history. Jefferson Davis, the Confederacy, said that slavery was established by a decree of the Almighty God and sanctioned in the Bible in both testaments from Genesis to Revelation. Even after slavery was abolished, we heard, again, these religious freedom arguments. Theodore Bilbo, a two-time governor of Mississippi, who helped filibuster anti-lynching legislation, used religion to justify racism and discrimination. He wrote that allowing the blood of races to mix was an attack on the divine plan of God. A century ago, Governor Allen Candler of Georgia said, God made them Negroes, and we cannot, by education, make them white folks, in defense of segregated schools. In 1960, Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett proclaimed that the good Lord was the original segregationist. In 1963, President Harry Truman, when asked whether he believed that integration would eventually lead to interracial marriage, responded by saying, I hope not. I don't believe in it. The Lord created it that way. You read your Bible and you'll find out. I do not understand that in this nation that believes, and in our faith traditions that believe that literally in our founding documents, all people are created equal, that we still have a nation that tolerates, in the majority of our states, overt discrimination, no recourse whatsoever, to be denied a seat at a lunch counter, to be denied public accommodation, to be denied service on a jury. This is so important that we don't mistake the valued and vaunted principle of religious freedom that I believe fully in to be in any way a disguise for overt discrimination against the equality of all Americans.
It is none of government's business what consenting adults do in their own bedrooms. It is none of government's business the sexual orientation or gender identity of adults in their own lives. But this bill is not about that. This bill is about mandating that biological males should be allowed to compete in girls' sports and women's sports, effectively repealing Title IX. This bill is about suing pastors and churches if they teach biblical teachings on sexuality and morality. This bill is about suing you, an individual citizen, if you dare speak and disagree with their mandated orthodoxy. This bill is about power, and this bill is dangerous.